Hi, this is Erin from Morehouse Farm with today's knitting tip, which is how to do a make one increase. Now, there's lots of different ways to do increases. This one is the make one where you simply knit into or work the stitch again for a second time. We'll cover other ones in different tutorials, but today we're going to concentrate on this one. So the first thing you do is simply knit a stitch as you would. I'll show you American style first, and then we'll go to continental next. Wrap the yarn, pull it through, but instead of dropping the stitch off of the needle, you're going to work it again by knitting it again. When you pull that loop through, then you can drop the original stitch off the needle. So knit as you would one before you drop the stitch off, knit that stitch again, then you can drop it off the needle. And that is simply knitting into the stitch again to create a second stitch as an increase. Now we'll go to continental, where the yarn is then held in the left hand. We'll knit this stitch and then work it again. Knit the stitch, work it again. Knit the stitch, work it again, and so forth until we're done. Now most patterns won't have you do this for every stitch, but this is good practice to watch. And as you can see, I've been increasing each stitch on the end here, which creates this diagonal up to the left where I'm adding a stitch on every other row. Now you may be called to make one when you purl, which is the same idea, working the stitch and then working the stitch again. Now with purling, it's going to depend on how your stitch is oriented, whether you're going to end up effectively knitting into the stitch or purling it again. So in this case, we're going to purl that stitch, bring the yarn to the front, and then knit it again, because one of those stitches is going to end up having the purl bump on it. You can see where we were knitting, every other row ends up having that bump or that little collar to the stitch, simply because of how the increase is made. And that's okay. That's why the pattern you're working on specifically calls for this. So if we're going to do it in the continental version, we'll purl, and then we'll work into that stitch a second time. Purl, and then work into that stitch a second time. And you get the picture. Happy knitting from Morehouse Farm.